is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Today's guest is Danielle Dreilinger. She traveled to Clarksdale, Mississippi for the Hechinger Report to spend time in the rural community's first charter school. She looked at how the campus is challenging some historical perceptions about what school choice means. Danielle, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thank you for having me.
Your piece is full of really rich and interesting history about rural Mississippi school system and segregation and the legacy of that. To quickly sort of sum things up for our audience, though, and give them a sense of where we're coming from, in 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court, of course, ruled in the Brown v. Board decision that school segregation was unlawful. But things didn't really change much in Mississippi, particularly in this community of Clarksdale. And we jump ahead now to 1969. And what happened then?
So at that point, the U.S. Supreme Court decided another case, Alexander versus Holmes County. And they decided that these freedom of choice school plans that were prevalent across the South were just not legal. And they just said that all remaining segregated districts have to integrate immediately. And that's the word they use, is immediately. So across the South, districts had managed to just drag their heels for, well over a decade, and they weren't going to be allowed to anymore. So over the course of just a few months, the Clarksdale and Coahoma County school districts created plans to stop running these two separate white and black systems and to integrate, except they basically never did integrate, because as soon as they announced the plans, white parents made plans to leave the district and to put their kids in private schools, either brand new ones or existing private schools that were expanding their enrollment for white kids to flee.
And these were what we now call segregation academies.
Right. Segregation academies were all white private schools that were created in 1970 or so across the South, precisely so white parents could have some place to put their kids. They're private schools. They tended to be fairly low cost. They are usually best known as being secular, though in Clarksdale, several of the religious schools expanded their enrollment as well to accommodate white flight. The exception being the Catholic school, after the Jackson bishop put his foot down and said that he would go to Rome if he had to stop them.
We're going to jump ahead again now. And even though there was this second Supreme Court order, the school system remained largely segregated, with Black students going to predominantly Black schools. And then now we have this new school that opens up, and that's Clarksdale Collegiate. Tell us a little bit about that school.
So Clarksdale Collegiate is the first rural charter school in Mississippi. It's the first charter school outside the capital of Jackson. And it opened last year as a K through 2. And they plan to have 150 students. And they ended up pretty close to that for their first year. It was 93% Black, 6% white, and mostly from the city of Clarksdale, with some kids from the surrounding county and the counties that are adjacent. And they are continuing this year with K through 3. They'll be growing up until they are a elementary and middle school.
So there's clearly the tension that's common in the charter school debate, which is this idea of a school siphoning off students and funding that would otherwise go to traditional public schools, many of which may be underfunded already, as is the case particularly in Mississippi. But school choice has a particular kind of negative connotation in Clarksdale. Explain that for us.
My editor, Sarah Garland from Hechinger Report, looked at this charter school opening in the Delta, and she immediately drew the connection to the segregation academies of the past. She pointed out that this is a place where school choice has meant segregation academies, has meant racist decisions about where your kids go to school. And she wondered what it meant for a charter school to open up with that history. And, it's interesting because when I talk to people locally, that didn't resonate with them so much, which is to say that there are so few white people in the area at all. Certainly, there are almost none in the public school system. So it's not that they were afraid that those kids were all going to, the people who had already left were going to leave all over again. But they were very sensitive to the prospect of yet another school pulling kids out of the public school system, taking money away from the public school system because the money follows the child, yet the school system having to maintain pretty much the same infrastructure with even fewer resources, with fewer teachers. And certainly the opponents of the charter school were concerned that the charter school was going to take the kids who were more affluent, who had more involved parents, parents who were savvy and who could advocate for their kids. And I will say that, and even though Clarksdale Collegiate is an open enrollment charter school with an anonymous lottery if they're over enrolled, there was nothing I could say to the critics of the charter school that would convince them that this enrollment was truly open and fair. They definitely thought that the charter school was picking its kids.
One thing that's obviously very important when writing about school choice is to talk to the families themselves. You spent time with the Deers, for example. Their son Ricky is a young student at Clarksdale Collegiate. What were some of the reasons they gave for choosing a charter school for their son?
They all just wanted something better for their kids. I mean, there was a parent I talked to, and he had his kid at a good elementary school, the elementary school that's right next door. That's the best rated elementary school in the area. And even there, he felt like the teachers weren't really engaged, and he felt like he had all of these ideas that like none of them wanted to listen to. So he felt like there was just this like malaise and depression, even among the staff at like the good school. But yeah, I mean, it was just the basic reason that any parent chooses a charter school, I think, is they weren't satisfied. And the Deers, they had their then foster, now adopted son, Ricky. He was in kindergarten in a local public school, and he just wasn't doing well. And he would come home and talk about how they watched movies and they were coloring. And they would get these reports from the teacher that said he wasn't doing well academically. But then he was getting all of these like awards from the school for how well he was doing. So that wasn't making sense. And that he couldn't read anything at all at the end of kindergarten. He couldn't read like basic sight words. And they just felt like, he was this smart, bright kid who was so interested in like science and airplanes and technology. And he was just not learning anything, and they wanted something better for him.
One of the criticisms that's become increasingly common in the charter school debate is the idea that white liberal voices who are opposed to charter schools are being heard more than the Black and Hispanic families who are more likely to support and indeed send their children to these campuses. How does that fit into what you heard and saw in Clarksdale?
I mean, the people running the charter school are almost across the board African American. I talked to Amanda Johnson about this, that her cohort of TFA people, a lot of them have stayed in the Delta and are Black and have really continued to work on charter school and school choice issues, and that they really have a strong network supporting school choice. So it was interesting, especially also, right, with the history of school choice in that region being these segregation academies, these white schools, that this was really a homegrown project. This was a woman she's from Little Rock originally. She'd lived in the Delta for well over 15 years at that point. She is Black. Most of the kids in the school are Black. And there was one white family I talked to who were newcomers in Clarksdale who had said basically they didn't know how they were going to stay now that they have kids who are school age until the charter school opened, because they didn't know what they were going to do to send their kids to school. But for the most part, the white people I met were either connected to the private schools, or they were public school teachers, or like the school system's lawyer went to Clarksdale High School while it was still segregated. So he graduated in the 60s. And even he was like, all the white people I know send their kids to private school. So, the school choice movement there is African American led, but it's also just, it's an area where there's been so much white flight that there just aren't very many white people, period.
We're talking with Danielle Dreilinger of the Hechinger Report about her reporting on the legacy of segregation on school choice in rural Mississippi. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback will help us grow. Danielle, we talked a little bit about what you found in your reporting. Now I want to talk about how you did that story. You actually found a local newspaper that was giving parents tips on how to work around the federal desegregation order back in 1970. Tell us about that.
Well, first of all, I would say one of my takeaways for reporting is always go to the library. Go to the library and read the back issues of the paper. So the daily paper in Clarksdale, they just laid out how white families could leave the district. They had one Black person, a famous man who ran the NAACP, whom they interviewed over and over and over again, but it was an entirely a white view of the situation. And they just gave, they gave the details that they gave about like this new private school, later named Lee Academy, that was opening. It was a segregation academy. They gave not only the times of the meetings when parents were talking about this, but they gave the phone number and the office location and the hours the office was open.
Incredible. It's also really important that you found not just these historical archives, but you also found people who were educated in these local schools over the past 50 years. How important were those voices to telling this particular story?
Oh, they were crucial. I could not have done the story without them. And, I'm lucky that it's not so long ago that many of them were still around. In fact, the woman I spoke to who went to Lee Academy, who was in that first class there, is a librarian. And I met her because I was at the microfilm machine all afternoon and I was leaving and she said, "Oh, did you find everything you were looking for?" And I said, "Oh, yeah. And I paused. And I said, "Well, actually, I have to admit," I said, I can't go back 50 years and be the editor of the Clarksdale paper, but I really wish that they had sent somebody to the opening day of Lee Academy so I could have the scene of what it looked like." And she said, "Oh, I went to Lee Academy." And I said, "Wow, are you allowed to talk with me when you're at work?" And she said, "Sure."
Yeah, it doesn't get much better than that. So, Danielle, you were a beat reporter for a long time in the New Orleans area. How did your experience covering choice in a district that eventually became almost entirely charter schools prepare you for this reporting trip?
One thing I think is it just made me very familiar with the arguments for and against charter schools. It certainly helped that I'm very familiar with all of the machinery around charter schools and charter school systems and the debate and the funders and things like how they're evaluated and how they have what they have to do to stay open. What I think was the biggest contrast or the biggest surprise, though, so I moved to New Orleans. It was 2012. Most of the schools were charter already. It was clear that the city was going in the direction of going all charter. And there was already a lot of familiarity with the hip shtick, for lack of a better term. So there's a lot of things that college prep charters do that are very similar, right? Like a lot of them, they have the college pennants on the walls. They have the inspirational slogans. They have the statements of values. They have the morning chant. They have particular discipline systems. They have a big focus on metrics and on showing kids metrics and having kids know their test scores and putting that stuff up. And they have long days and they have intensive literacy blocks. It's certainly not like all charter schools are like this, but that's a very common style. So I know that you can look like that and be a crummy school. And what surprised me was the utter lack of experience in Clarksdale with that model of school. And there were a whole lot of people I talked to who were so impressed by what the charter school was doing. And I ask, like, for instance, the church where they're renting space. There was a day that I was reporting that the church came back in and used the space. And I was talking to the women who, like the charter school, like saved their bacon because they really needed the rent money. And they were enthusing about what a wonderful school it was. These were all, retired white ladies. And I said, oh, how do you know it's a good school? Like, have you been in the classrooms? And they said, oh, like the college pennants on the walls, everything says scholar on it. They all talk about how they're going to college. They chant about they're going to college. And I just sort of sat there and was like, like it's so impressive to people who haven't seen it. And I thought it was really striking to me, like how powerful all of those visuals are when you're not familiar with them, which is not to say, by the way, that Clarksdale Collegiate is all show and no substance at all. I mean, their test scores at the end of the first year were really, really good. But it was interesting to be in a place where there's so little familiarity with that style of education when I was coming from New Orleans, where that's all par for the course.
There is understandably a lot of criticism of what people term as parachute journalism, reporters sort of just coming into a community just for a one-off. How did you fight your way around that to report this story in Mississippi?
I'm still not used to being a parachute journalist. I find it stressful. I find it uncomfortable in a lot of ways. And you have to be just incredibly open about saying, I'm not from here. What should I know? One of my favorite questions, and this works across a whole lot of different stories, but especially in a parachute situation, is to say, what do people get wrong? Like, what do people get wrong when they report about this stuff? Like when they come and they report about you. I've been to Clarksdale a number of times before because I live in New Orleans and it is a tourism center.
As the home of the birthplace of the blues, just to explain to our listeners.
Right. Birthplace of the blues. And they have a bunch of festivals over the course of the year that really bring a ton of people into town. So I know going in that it was more than just a place of poverty. Whenever you read about the Delta, it seems like it's always like impoverished poverty. And that felt really incomplete and unfair. I mean, who wants to read that about themselves as if that's all they are? So I asked people, I said, this place is often described by outsiders in terms of poverty. What else is there? Like, what should I be reporting instead? And so, they would tell me about how warm it was and how welcoming and what a strong community they felt there. And certainly also being a white person going in reporting a story about primarily African American subjects, I just tried to be straightforward in bringing up various issues and being upfront about it. And if anything, the people who were weird talking to me about race were the white people. They're strangely vague. I had to do a lot of trying to pin people down. So one woman was talking to me about her experience going through school integration in 1970. And she said, well, me personally, I would have been fine with it. And she just paused and she stared at me like I should know what she was talking about. And I'm from the Northeast, whatever that understanding is supposed to be, I certainly had no idea. And I said, well, what do you mean it? And she said, well, it. And I'm like, well, but like, what do you mean by it? And she said, I mean, going to school with African American kids. There was a lot of that sort of weird stop, pause, say something euphemistic, stare at me like I should know what they're talking about. And, I'm certainly not surprised to say that it was from white people that I was mostly hearing the "can everybody forget about the past" comments. Whereas there were African American people I spoke to who were saying, no, we need to talk about the past. The past is still present. Like the Academy is still disproportionately white compared to the community.
One of the things I do think comes through in your story is there is this sort of terrible dilemma, which is that the traditional public schools are underfunded and the students are underserved. that, to be sure, the African-American kids in this community, the local district has arguably had more than 60 years to try to figure this out and get it right. And why shouldn't you support this upstart campus if they can do it better? To want every kid to have that opportunity for that kind of school experience. I really do feel like that dilemma isn't solved in your story, but it's pretty transparent.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's a school choice dilemma. Absolutely. Nicole Hannah-Jones had the great story that has resurfaced in response to the Atlantic story of September about where to put her own kid in an effort to not feed larger oppressive social structures. So how many parents are willing to, in their minds, sacrifice their own kid for the principles of not further draining the school system? So here's one of the great illuminating details that history brings to this story is there's so many of these terms that are current in the charter school debate that you go back to 1970 and you look at the local paper and those people were using those terms to justify having segregated schools. So, parent choice. White parents in 1970 in Clarksdale who sent their kids to the private school presumably thought they were doing the right thing for their kids. And it's uncomfortable. And it was something that I tried to get the librarian I spoke to who went to Lee Academy and when it started, I asked her point blank several times in different ways about whether she was okay with the fact that her parents had done that, whether, she felt it was the right decision, whether she thought it was wrong. Your parents didn't want you going to school with Black kids and they put you in a private school. Was that okay? And she said, I can't judge them. They did what they think was best.
For reporters who want to follow your substantial lead in covering school choice and charters and even some of these rural issues, what are a couple of story ideas for them?
There's lots of different angles of this story, and so there are lots of different ideas. One is, go look in the private school universe survey data and see what the breakdown is of the private schools in your area, because there might be schools that surprise you one way or the other, especially if you've lived in a place for a while, certainly, especially if you're covering some place you grew up. People become so accustomed to just, that's the way things are and that's the way things have been, that sometimes we don't realize the extent to which you may well have a segregation academy where you are, and it's still operating very similarly. And even if it's legally has some sort of non-discrimination statement on its website, it's still maybe a place that Black families are not going to send their kids because they know the reputation. Certainly as an outsider coming down to the South, I was really surprised that how many of these schools are still around. If anything, there was a wonderful story I never got to do, and other people should feel free to take this and run with it. But there was a school that I wanted to write about that had been a segregation academy that had finally integrated thanks to a voucher program. And I so wanted to write about it for the Times-Picayune. I never got around to it. If you find that in your area, please, somebody should do those stories. Those are amazing stories. Generally speaking, people open charter schools because they want to do better and they think that's how they can do it. And that's why people send their kids to those schools and teach at those schools. And I think that getting outside the politics of the debate is really fruitful when it comes to story ideas.
Danielle Dreilinger is a freelance education journalist, and she covered the New Orleans public school system for the Times-Picayune and NOLA.com from 2012 to 2017. She's also a former EWA reporting fellow. Danielle, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Of course, thank you.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to know more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thank you for listening.